Katichanda Lake Eyre is a huge salt lake bed located in southern Australia. This is a remote desert area, and given the scarcity of rainfall, it only fills in about once every 8 years. At most, depending on the rainfall that year, a smaller portion of the lake bed is filled in with only a couple inches of water. When the conditions are right, however, these couple of inches can be as reflective as a mirror, stretching out as far as the eye can see. Landscape photographer Murray Fredericks has sought to capture the beauty and surreal nature of this phenomenon through his photography. In one particular project of his, he took a large mirror into the middle of the lake to reflect other angles of the land and sky. As you can see, this creates otherworldly looking images. Fredericks isn't interested in literally capturing the landscape as we might see on a postcard. He's more interested in how such wild spaciousness can invite viewers to pause even for a moment and experience the sense of calm nature can bring. Now, this came from an experience he had early on when he was initially exploring this lake. Every day he would ride an hour from his campsite to the middle of the lake where his gear was set up, and oftentimes he would be going out at night. He didn't use a GPS at the time, only a compass to guide him back and forth. One night, it wasn't until he got all the way out to his camera in the middle of the lake that he realized he had left his compass behind. He was in the middle of a lake, in the middle of a desert, and suddenly very painfully aware that he had no idea how to get back to his campsite or even what direction to head in. The lake is reflective, remember? Each direction that he looked in, it was completely flat with no landmarks on the horizon, just the sky reflected back at him. Very little light, no wind, no sound, just the emptiness of the space and the growing discomfort such disorientation brought, and perhaps a growing sense of fear. And as he sat with those emotions and tried to figure out where to go next, he suddenly experienced an unfamiliar and powerful sensation of calm. Somehow, in the presence of such beauty, even in the midst of his discomfort and disorientation, he felt relaxed, freed from the ever-present anxieties of everyday life. That experience of calm and beauty became a guide for him as he returned with his camera to visually capture that experience, a gift of the wilderness he sought to share with others. I'm fascinated by this story because honestly, while such calm sounds amazing right now, the idea of being stranded in the wilderness with no sense of direction doesn't sound as appealing to me. Now, I'm grateful Fredericks has photographs to help convey his experience. And yet such experiences are modeled for us, even in the Christian tradition. Somehow the wilderness, often a way of speaking of seasons of discomfort in our spiritual journeys, becomes a place where we are surprised by the presence of God. And if we stick with it, this spiritual journey can help us find such grace and peace, no matter what our current landscape may be. And that sounds like a true gift. Friends, it is this journey we are invited into as we enter into the season of Lent. Lent has often been a time of intentional self-reflection and spiritual growth. We mark it by committing to spiritual practices for 40-some days in order to recenter ourselves in God and reflect on the ways we live out our faith in the world. Now, over this Lenten season, we're going to dive more into Christian spirituality to help us discover ways of living meaningfully. But the truth is, as we set aside this season as an intentional period, we do so because the work of spiritual growth is not always easy. It can often take us into places of discomfort, as we see in this story of Jesus' own wilderness experience. In 2 short verses, Mark tells us that Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. While there, he encounters temptations and wild animals. Now, as short as this account may be, the starkness of Mark's gospel reflects the starkness of the wilderness. I once saw this illustrated version of Jesus' time in the wilderness, and at first he's smiling and happy. It's like a vacation almost. Jesus is off in the desert, looking at the beauty of the wilderness. He's noticing the animals. He's chasing birds like a toddler chases seagulls at the boardwalk. He's tossing stones and smiling contentedly. He's praying and resting. It looks amazing. But then slowly, as the days go by, Jesus grows a little more haggard and weary looking. You begin to see his hunger, his clothes torn from some thorns he got stuck in. He's sweating from the intensity of the sun's heat, and he's worn out. And then come the temptations. It reminds me that even when we are prepared, the wilderness is a hard place. Now, Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus goes into such a difficult place, and biblical scholars often debate the reasoning. But there seems to be one line of thinking that since this comes right before his public ministry begins, Jesus might have been in the wilderness for some intentional self-reflection and prayer to prepare for this ministry. Maybe he was sensing the need for some change and transformation before things really got started, but quite the place to go, right? And yet, in the 4th century, men and women followed his example. They went into the desert areas of Western Egypt and Palestine and Arabia. They wanted to go deeper in their faith and connection with God, but they found themselves distracted by the busyness of the culture around them. So they left their cities and went into the wilderness, following Jesus' path. Over time, this group of men and women became known as Abbas and Ammas, as the desert fathers and mothers, renowned spiritual teachers who gave birth to monastic Christianity and spirituality. In the wilderness, they found a spirituality and a wisdom that helped them to live a meaningful and authentic life that was rooted in deep connection with God. Now, even though this was centuries ago, this is what we're looking for as well. To live a meaningful and authentic life where our inner values are reflected in how we live and what we do. Where we not just notice, but savor moments of joy, grace, and wonder each day. Where we feel our relationship with God deepen over time. Where we can feel peace and calm in the midst of life's anxieties and busyness. But our lives are full and crowded with lots of things to do that bring about feelings of anxiety, expectation, exhaustion, and drudgery. And that keeps us moving because slowing down or taking time for self-reflection often makes us uncomfortably aware of our anxiety and exhaustion without a clear sense for what to do with them. And honestly, who has time for feelings like those or the discomfort they can bring? It's easier some days to keep moving and try to push through any discomfort or sadness. And with the way our lives are structured, we don't ever have to be alone with such feelings or wrestle with the questions they bring up for us about, who are we and what is it that we want out of life and what are we looking for? Everything we could ever want to distract ourselves is easily within reach. Now, in one of the stories that comes from this desert tradition, a monk comes to visit Abba Moses and asks him for a word. And Abba Moses tells him, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Now, the cell was a metaphor for the soul work of the spiritual journey. And that's what we're called to in the season of Lent. It's the place where we come into full presence with ourselves and all our inner voices and emotions and challenges. We're called to go and sit with those things. And if we can do so, we find that it's also the place where we encounter God deep in our hearts. Now, something about stopping and acknowledging these feelings can make us feel fragile. And this fragility is what the desert mothers and fathers, what Jesus faced in the wilderness. And without anything to numb them or keep them busy, they had to face their inner voices, feelings, temptations, distractions, and any thoughts that would arise. All they could do in such a space was be present to what the journey brought forth and meet themselves, to meet these vulnerable and tender places of themselves with gentleness and compassion. And rather than being undone or overwhelmed, they rediscovered blessing. Friends, this is important. Remember what immediately precedes Jesus' time in the wilderness? Mark tells us it's his baptism. Before Jesus finds himself in the wilderness, God meets him at the water and calls him beloved. Then in the wilderness, angels come and wait upon Jesus. And in fact, the common element in Mark's telling of the story is God's presence at baptism and again in the wilderness. God isn't just there, though. God is tending to Jesus, reminding him who he is, guiding him, transforming him as Jesus takes the blessing of his baptism and comes to see it, to claim it for himself. God is with us too. In our wilderness spaces, at the threshold of new journeys, in seasons and times of discomfort, God meets us and reminds us that we too are beloved. We are loved in the middle of life's messiness. Each day, God meets us with gentleness and compassion. And God invites us to do so as well. To show up to ourselves and what we will encounter in our journeys with gentleness and compassion so we can rediscover and claim this blessing for ourselves. Because in this blessing, friends, God leads us to a meaningful life. By claiming our blessing, by knowing that we are inherently and deeply loved, we grow in our compassion for ourselves as we learn to show such love towards what makes us vulnerable and human. And then by embracing our humanity, we can grow in our compassion and showing such love towards others. And as we behold such grace in our lives and in those around us, we find God's abiding peace in the midst of life's messiness and brokenness. Suddenly, we ourselves experience that calm assurance, that sureness of God's goodness. And that becomes our guide to live by. Not fear, not anxiety, not those voices that try and tell us who we are, but the voice of God who tells us we are beloved. Friends, we come to this Lent to remember and discover this again, to remember who we are. We don't know what this season will hold for us, but we can trust that whatever it brings, there will be angels attending to us in the midst of any discomfort. God will meet us here to remind us we are beloved and not alone. So this week, I want you to try practicing the spirituality of the wilderness by reminding yourself of this blessing. One practice that can help us remember is breath prayers. When feelings of discomfort arise, in that moment, take time to focus on your breathing. Bring your attention to it, and once you are aware, each time you inhale, pray Nothing can separate me. And then when you exhale, pray from the love of God. Nothing can separate me from the love of God. Nothing can separate me from the love of God. As you pray this week, I hope and pray that you see it as so, that God is with you as close as your breath. Let me say it one more time, in the hopes that over these next 40-some days, you will rediscover the Spirit speaking deep inside of you. You are beloved. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.